No one could ride it. No one dared come close. It had defeated the best of them, casting a shadow of fear over the entire ranch. They called it a beast, a ghost with iron hooves. But then, on a blazing afternoon, an old man walked in. He carried nothing but a worn-out hat, a gaze that pierced the soul, and a past no one ever saw coming. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if this story grips you, don't forget to subscribe. Shadow Ridge Ranch lay beneath the scorching Texan sun, its dusty red soil stretching across the horizon. For decades, the ranch had been known for raising fine horses, each carefully bred to maintain strong bloodlines and prized for their resilience. At the helm stood Henry Callahan, a stern, experienced ranch owner whose pride in his stock ran as deep as his family roots. From the outside, Shadow Ridge looked like the epitome of success. Clean paddocks, well-trained horses, and a legacy Henry guarded with unwavering determination. Yet, that morning, a tension crackled through the ranch like a desert storm on the verge of breaking. The blazing sunlight only sharpened the sense of unease. Midnight, a newly purchased black horse of Spanish lineage, had upended the peace of Shadow Ridge in the span of just 3 weeks. Henry had acquired this imposing stallion at a prestigious auction for a hefty sum. Initially, he believed that adding Midnight to his breeding lines would elevate the ranch's reputation even further. But in reality, Midnight had become a living nightmare. From the moment the horse had stepped off the transport trailer, he'd shown an unbreakable will. In less than 21 days, the restless stallion had tossed, kicked, or trampled 5 experienced wranglers and trainers. One man suffered a broken arm. Another ended up hospitalized with severe bruises. Attempts to approach Midnight often resulted in fresh injuries. In the words of those who dared come near, the horse's eyes flashed with a wild intelligence and a primal aggression. Some said he was fearless. Others claimed he was the devil incarnate. Regardless, no one could get within 10 feet of him without risking life and limb. A young ranch hand muttered under his breath that maybe the horse had come from a cursed bloodline, or that it was simply too feral to adapt. The truth was that no matter the method, gentle coaxing, firm discipline, or even sedation, Midnight refused to be touched, bridled, or saddled. Barriers were set up to keep him contained in a large round pen, but it felt like nothing more than a temporary fix. The ranch's best efforts went unheeded. Everyone recognized that if this horse could not be controlled soon, Henry's proud reputation might crumble. Tom Callahan, Henry's son and the ranch's primary manager, bore the brunt of this stress. Tom wasn't merely a supervisor. He'd spent much of his life on these dusty fields, learning the trade from Henry. He prided himself on his level head and his ability to find solutions. But faced with Midnight's brutal unpredictability, Tom was just as perplexed as the rest. Each day, he updated Henry on fresh injuries or new attempts at taming the horse. And each day, Henry's frown deepened. Close by, Frank Dawson, a veteran worker who'd seen more wild horses than he could count, wore a sling around his left arm. Frank had learned a hard lesson a week earlier, getting thrown violently against the fence by one of Midnight's savage bucks. Shaking his head, Frank recalled that he hadn't encountered a horse like this in his entire 30-year career. When asked if they should keep trying, he'd exhale a short breath and say, "Midnight's like a storm, unpredictable and destructive if you don't know how to navigate it." Not everyone was so philosophical. Jesse Ray, a confident younger trainer, had approached Midnight with the swagger of a man who thought no horse could outdo him. His arrogance had earned him a nasty collision with the pen fence, and a black eye that still had him wincing days later. Now, Jesse spat the word demon whenever anyone mentioned the stallion. Morale in the yard plummeted. Whispers circulated that the ranch should put Midnight down before he caused worse harm. "He's too dangerous," a ranch hand muttered. One more accident, and someone might not walk away. Others, concerned about lawsuits or injuries, thought it practical to end the problem quickly. Yet, for all the mounting pressure, Henry refused to consider killing the horse. Something about Midnight's raw power intrigued him on a deeper level. As far as he was concerned, The horse's blood was the purest he'd come across in years. Ending him prematurely would be a crime against his breeding ambitions, not to mention a blow to his pride. Standing by the corral, Henry ground his boot heel into the dust, arms crossed over his chest. The sun beat down mercilessly, and he swiped away sweat trickling from beneath his wide-brimmed hat. Meeting Tom's gaze, Henry made himself clear. "We're not shooting that horse," he said. "Not when there's a chance to salvage him. His lineage alone is worth more than half the horses here combined." Tom inhaled, unsure. He knew his father's obstinacy would clash with the danger this horse presented. If they couldn't break midnight soon, there'd be consequences for the entire ranch. Already, rumors were spreading among neighboring ranches that Shadow Ridge had welcomed a monstrous stallion. Henry's once sterling prestige was at risk. With a curt nod, Tom acknowledged his father's stance but couldn't shake his growing worry. Midnight might be the ranch's crowning jewel or its downfall. Though Henry spoke with firm conviction, part of him sensed the precariousness of the situation. He would never show weakness in front of his men. But deep down, he recognized that the ranch's reputation hinged on taming or rehoming this horse. If Midnight remained a threat, word would spread. Traders, breeders, and potential clients might second-guess doing business with Shadow Ridge. Reputations took years to build and only days to destroy. Henry had far too much riding on a single horse, but he wouldn't accept defeat. Not yet. By day's end, the oppressive heat gave way to a lonely, windless dusk. The ranch hands gathered for a quick meeting in the barn, discussing new tactics or whether it might be best to hire outside experts. Tension ran high. No consensus arose. Henry, stoic as ever, left them to their bickering. He paced the yard, measuring each footstep. Midnight's presence in the corral behind him loomed like a menacing shadow. The horse tossed his head, ears pinned back, seemingly daring the world to try him one more time. A single thought coursed through Henry's mind. He would not lose this battle. With a low grumble, he turned on his heel, mentally devising a plan. One thing was certain. Midnight's challenge would force them to consider options they'd never dreamed of before. Twilight deepened, blanketing the ranch in soft purples and oranges. In the bunkhouse and around the open yard, small clusters of hands convened, their voices low with concern. Tom sat at a makeshift table beneath a flickering lantern, Jesse and Frank flanking him. A couple of the more talkative workers leaned in, arms folded. They were trying to devise another strategy for dealing with Midnight. Ideas flew around in hushed tones. Extend the time he was penned alone. Use sedation more aggressively. Bring in specialized trainers from out of state. Or install reinforced fencing. But each suggestion fell flat. Nobody truly believed they could solve the problem through standard means. After all, 5 of the region's most skilled men had already failed. And not just failed, but been forced into submission by a single horse. "Maybe we should just keep him penned up for good," Jesse muttered, gingerly touching the blackened bruise around his eye. "He can't hurt us if we don't try to ride him." Tom shook his head. "That horse cost a fortune." "Jesse, we can't just let him rot in a pen." Frank, Sling still cradling his injured arm, spoke quietly. "I've never seen a horse like this. He's too smart, too quick to lash out. Our usual methods, they haven't worked." In that dimly lit circle, a wave of resignation washed over them. The men recognized that, logically, sedation or euthanasia might be the only ways to avoid further injury. But the mere mention of putting the horse down triggered an instant chill. Henry would never allow it. Perhaps they could hire a legendary trainer from out of state, or pay top dollar for someone who specialized in unbreakable horses. The problem was, their ranch budget couldn't handle another huge expense if they'd already spent so much acquiring Midnight. From the edge of the group, a quiet voice broke the tension. Luke Callahan, just 18, had been listening silently, absorbing every word. He was Henry's grandson, but lacked the commanding presence of his grandfather or the confident swagger of Tom. Despite that, Luke often surprised people with his keen observations. "Grandpa used to tell me a story," Luke began, voice low. He mentioned a man who could talk to horses. a man named Jack Morrison. The table went quiet. Jesse shifted, about to make a cutting remark. But Frank's brow furrowed. Jack Morrison, he repeated in a near whisper, as if recalling a distant memory. You don't mean that old rumor about the whisperer from Appalachia, do you? Luke nodded. Yes, him. Grandpa said he once worked miracles with horses no one else could tame. Some folks claimed he only needed to look into a horse's eyes to calm it. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the group. They'd heard tall tales before, stories of mystical horse whisperers, men who roamed the West taming beasts. Often such tales were exaggerations, illusions of skill, or plain lies. Jesse Ray sneered. Let me guess. The old man's probably half senile by now, or 6 feet under. Either way, I doubt he can help us. Undeterred, Luke pressed on. He's said to be alive somewhere in the hills, living away from civilization. At least, that's what Grandpa told me. If we can find him, maybe, just maybe, he could do something about Midnight. More skeptical comments followed, but the mention of Jack Morrison's name struck a chord in Frank Dawson. He had once known a wandering trainer by that name, a man rumored to be different, speaking softly to wild horses as though forging a private bond. That had been decades ago, and Frank had almost forgotten. Silence descended. They couldn't be sure if Luke's suggestion was pure fantasy or a spark of genuine hope. In the gloom, the only sound was the faint rustling of straw in the barn and the occasional snort of a restless horse. Suddenly, a presence made itself known. Standing in the doorway, arms folded, was Henry Callahan. He'd been listening, unseen, for long enough to catch the drift of their conversation. The ranch hands stood immediately, hats in hand out of respect. Henry scanned their faces, expression stern as usual, but there was a flicker of thought behind his eyes. All right, he said at last, voice calm but commanding. So you're talking about Jack Morrison. Some of you think it's just a fairy tale. He stepped forward, the lantern's light casting his shadow across the group. But I've heard those rumors too, and maybe it's time we put them to the test. Tom drew a breath. Dad, you can't be serious. If he's even alive, how do we reach him? Henry looked at his son, then at Luke. We'll find a way. I'm done with half measures. If Morrison truly has the skill, we'll bring him here. If it costs extra, so be it. Jesse Ray huffed, as though wishing to protest, but fear of Henry's disapproval kept him silent. Frank's good hand pressed against the table. Jack Morrison could be anywhere. He might refuse. Henry nodded. He might. But I have something he lost a long time ago. Something that might change his mind. The others stood in curiosity, wondering what Henry might be referring to, and yet they didn't dare question him further. There was an air of resolution in his tone that made defiance futile. We'll spread word through the local towns, the feed stores, the mercantile, anywhere an old wanderer might show up, Henry declared. And if it takes a bounty, so be it. I want to talk to this man. Tom studied his father's face, searching for any hint of uncertainty. Instead, he found only a quiet determination. All right, Tom replied eventually. But if Morrison refuses, or if he can't handle a horse like Midnight, Henry cut him off. That's for him to decide. Then, more quietly, as though speaking to himself, he added, if there's anyone left alive who can prove my father wrong about certain matters, it might just be that old man. With that final remark, Henry turned on his heel and stepped out into the night. The men left behind exchanged uneasy glances, not certain whether to believe in the faint glimmer of hope or to brace for a deeper disappointment. Luke said nothing more, but inside, he felt the first stirrings of excitement. He had faith in the story he'd heard so many times, of a near-mythical trainer who tamed horses the way a conductor guided an orchestra, forging harmony from chaos. Amid the lamplight and the swirl of dust in the barn, the decision was made. They would search for Jack Morrison, the man rumored to speak the language of horses. Whether or not he could unravel the mystery of a vicious stallion named Midnight remained to be seen. Yet, an unspoken current of anticipation filled the air. They knew that if Jack did appear at Shadow Ridge, his arrival might herald more than just the taming of a wild beast. It might also bring to light the hidden threads of a past no one had dared to confront. 3 days after the decision to find Jack Morrison, the dusty road leading to Shadow Ridge Ranch lay shimmering beneath the morning sun. A solitary figure emerged on the far end of that road, moving slowly as though each step carried the weight of time. Despite the heat, the stranger wore a faded denim shirt and well-worn jeans, the knees patched and frayed. His boots, coated in the red-brown dust of the region, spoke of countless miles traveled. A scuffed leather hat shaded his face, and he carried a small canvas satchel slung over his shoulder. From a distance, Luke Callahan was the first to notice. He had been on his way to the stables when that lone silhouette caught his eye. Squinting, he recognized a certain air of purpose about the man, though he could not yet see his features. Without hesitation, Luke sprinted across the yard to find his grandfather. Henry, inside the main house, he breathlessly announced, "Grandpa, I think someone's arrived. An older man. He might be—" Luke never finished his sentence. Henry's gaze sharpened with the understanding that today could be the day they had been waiting for. Wordlessly, he led Luke outside and paused on the wide porch, scanning the horizon. Sure enough, the figure was still making his methodical approach. The ranch hands, scattered around the yard, paused whatever they were doing to watch. A quiet ripple of anticipation spread among them as the old man finally reached the main gate. Walking through the gate, he paused under the ranch's sign, Shadow Ridge, giving it a faint, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. He stepped farther in, and now they could see him clearly, late 60s, possibly older, a gaunt face lined by years beneath the sun. Eyes that flicked around the ranch as if recognizing memories in each corner. Near the corral, half a dozen ranch hands stood in a loose semicircle, curiosity burning in their expressions. Jesse Ray, still sporting a faint bruise on his cheek from his last encounter with Midnight, let out a barking laugh. "So that's him?" he said loudly. "The legend we've all been waiting for looks like he's about ready for a walker." Some of the younger workers snorted in agreement, muttering terms like has-been and museum piece. Yet they kept their distance. Despite their mockery, there was an undercurrent of respect, or at least caution, in the air. Frank Dawson, the oldest hand at Shadow Ridge, stepped forward, removing his hat. He said nothing, only dipped his head to the newcomer in a silent gesture that hinted at recognition or reverence. The old man, Jack Morrison, did not seem perturbed by the murmurs. He cast a brief glance at Jesse, then at the others, expression unreadable. If their jibes pricked him, he gave no sign. Instead, his gaze roamed across the yard, taking in the barns, the stables, the well-trodden paths that dissected the property. An almost electric hush descended when Henry Callahan appeared on the second-floor balcony of the ranch house. Henry walked to the railing and stared down at Jack with an intensity that made a few onlookers glance away, suddenly uncomfortable. Here were two men, each shaped by Shadow Ridge in different ways. One had built his life on it. The other had been cast out in the name of familial pride and hidden secrets. Jack stopped in the center of the open yard, chin lifted as he looked at Henry. Though both were older men now, there was a subtle tension in the air, as though time had collapsed and thrown them back into a former standoff. After a moment, Henry turned from the balcony and descended the front steps, each slow footfall echoing on the wooden planks. He approached Jack in silence. They stood face to face. Henry was the first to speak, extending his right hand. "Thank you for coming." "Jack, he hesitated, searching for a polite phrase but settling for a simple truth. "We appreciate it." Jack's gaze dropped to Henry's outstretched palm before lifting to meet his eyes. There was a flicker of old wounds in Jack's expression, as if remembering the last time he stood on this land. "Finally," he responded, voice calm and low. "I didn't come for you, Henry," he said. "I came for the horse." No one dared breathe too loudly. The ranch hands looked on, some with widened eyes, expecting an outburst of anger or resentment. Henry's outstretched hand wavered briefly. Then he let it drop to his side. He gave a measured nod, working hard to maintain composure. "Fair enough," Henry replied softly. "The horse is what we need help with. Though neither man spoke of the past outright, everyone present sensed the chill in the air. There was no open hostility, nor the warmth of a reunion, just a brittle stillness that set people on edge. Even Jesse Ray, often prone to cheap comments, found himself speechless. Henry gestured for the onlookers to disperse. "All right, back to work. Tom, you can finish the inventory in the barn. Jesse, I need you to fix that broken fence by the west corral." His voice brooked no argument. Reluctantly, the ranch hands peeled away, casting fleeting glances at Jack, who remained planted in the center of the yard. Luke lingered for a moment, curiosity alight in his face, but eventually followed the others. Now that the yard was emptier, Jack allowed himself a moment to take in every detail: the sagging roof of the bunkhouse, the distant shape of the round pen where Midnight was likely penned, the weathered barn doors. Everything looked both familiar and strangely foreign. He took a steadying breath, though it felt thick in his lungs. Pausing near a dusty patch of grass, Jack removed his battered hat. Holding it briefly to his chest, he gave a silent nod, part salute, part homage, to the land he once called home. Then, placing the hat back on his head, he looked to Henry as if to say, "Lead the way." Henry's eyes flickered with an emotion too guarded to name, and he dipped his head in acknowledgement. Without another word, the two men headed toward the main stables, side by side yet not entirely together, the distance between them a testament to all that lay unspoken. Moments later, they reached the large round pen near the far end of the property. Inside, Midnight, still known by that name here, stomped and snorted, his dark coat gleaming under the midday sun. His eyes flickered red with aggression, and his ears lay flat whenever someone stepped too close to the fence. Despite the wide perimeter, the horse made the space feel cramped with his restless energy. A small crowd began to form again, though they kept a safer distance this time. Curiosity drove them, and maybe a faint hope that Jack's legendary reputation would prove true. The tension in the air was palpable. Half the ranch hands seemed to root for Jack's success. The other half, more skeptical, waited for the old man to fail, if not be trampled. Jack paused at the fence, resting one hand on the top rail. He stared at Midnight for a full minute, saying nothing, barely moving, as if sizing up the horse the way a sculptor would evaluate a block of marble. Midnight, for his part, let out a shrill squeal and pawed the ground, sending dirt flying, yet he did not charge the fence as he often did. Instead, he regarded Jack with a strange wariness, ears pricked forward and then back again. The onlookers exchanged glances. Something in that silent standoff felt significant, though none could articulate why. At last, Henry stepped closer, speaking in a subdued tone. "Careful. He's thrown stronger men than you, Jack." Jack did not look away from the stallion. "Stronger arms? Maybe," he murmured. "Not necessarily stronger hearts." Turning to face the crowd, Jack spoke up so all could hear. "I need every single one of you to leave. No watchers, no voices. I want no one around but me and the horse." An immediate uproar ensued. Jesse Ray spat. "That's insane. You want to get yourself killed with no witnesses?" Some ranch hands nodded their agreement, muttering that it was too dangerous. Tom frowned, torn between respecting Jack's demand and worrying about another accident. Even Henry looked momentarily taken aback by the request. From the back of the group, Frank Dawson, arm still bandaged, cleared his throat. "If you really are Jack Morrison, and you can do what they say you can, I suppose you have your reasons." Jesse flung him a scowl. "We can't just leave him alone with that devil horse. He'll wind up half dead." Frank shrugged. "It's not our call. The man has asked." "Henry?" All eyes shifted to Henry Callahan. He wiped a bead of sweat from his temple, then exhaled. "All right," he said finally, his voice echoing with authority. "If Jack wants no audience, that's what he'll have. Anyone who disobeys can find another ranch to work on." Jesse's jaw clenched in frustration, but he kept quiet. A ripple of shock passed through the hands. They had rarely seen Henry give in so absolutely to anyone's demand. Meanwhile, Jack watched with a calm expression. Before they left, Jack's voice cut through the murmurs. All your youth and strength, you used force. Whips. Shouting. What did it get you? He nodded toward Frank's bandaged arm. Broken bones, bruised pride. And him, he motioned to Jesse's faint bruise. More scars than lessons. A prickly silence fell over them. Some men glanced away. Others bristled at the perceived insult. Jack continued, gentle yet firm. If you can't learn from an old man who's been broken and scarred more times than he can count, then you can't learn from horses either. No one had a ready reply. Jesse's face reddened, but he said nothing. Tom shifted uncomfortably, vaguely recalling how Henry had once mentioned the name Morrison in hushed, regretful tones. Now, Tom realized that there was clearly more to Jack's story than mere legend. Without further argument, the group retreated. Henry gestured for them to go, though he himself lingered one last moment. His gaze flicked between Jack and Midnight, torn between fear for the old man's safety and the possibility of a miracle. Finally, he gave Jack a nod, something between respect and silent apology, and stepped away. The heavy wooden gate creaked shut behind Henry. A hush settled over the ranch yard, and the watchers slowly dispersed, though many hovered near the barns or the corners of the fence, unwilling to stray too far. Inside the round pen, Midnight let out a piercing neigh, ears swiveling. Jack stayed perfectly still, waiting until the dust stirred by the departing feet settled back to the ground. Two figures remained, a war-scarred old man and a half-crazed stallion. In that hush, it felt like the entire ranch held its breath, the slightest sound magnified. Jack slowly approached the center of the pen, measuring each footstep with care. Midnight turned to face him, tail swishing in agitation. They were, in their own ways, both exiles on this land. Jack lowered himself to a crouch, letting his fingers brush the dust. For a moment, the spectacle was oddly serene. A silent man, a restless horse, and the wide Texan sky overhead. Beyond the rails, the men who pretended to leave watched from a safe distance, eyes glued to the pen. A ranch hand whispered, "Either he's the bravest fool or the cleverest man I've ever seen." No one, however, would argue that something remarkable was about to unfold. The sun dipped low, painting the sky with strokes of orange and pink as evening arrived. Hour after hour had passed with the round pen off limits to any onlookers. The ranch hands had busied themselves with chores, but a heavy curiosity weighed on their minds. What was happening inside that pen? Would they find Jack trampled, or would they discover something else entirely? Eventually, as dusk settled, a group of them gathered at a distance near the fence line. Jesse Ray, rubbing his bruised cheek, muttered, "He's got to be dead in there by now." That horse doesn't take kindly to new faces, but the fear in his voice betrayed genuine concern. Tom Callahan stood nearby, arms crossed. He had tried to focus on his ranch duties, but worry gnawed at him. Meanwhile, Frank Dawson leaned against a fence post, silently praying that the old tales about Jack Morrison's horse whispering were true. When the sun finally touched the horizon, Henry Callahan emerged from the main house. Without a word, he strode toward the round pen. The rest followed at his heels, a wave of anxious faces, readying themselves for the worst. As they drew closer, no shrieks of anger or thunderous galloping erupted, only the soft hum of evening insects and the shuffle of boots in the dirt. What they saw upon reaching the fence stole the breath from every set of lungs. Jack Morrison was seated on a low wooden block near the pen's center, his posture relaxed as though he'd been there for ages, and beside him stood Midnight, or rather, the stallion who had terrorized the ranch for weeks. Except this horse was no longer pawing the earth or baring his teeth. He was calmly grazing, head dipped, muscles at ease, as if he had never known rage at all. For a few seconds, no one dared speak. Jesse Ray was the first to break the hush, his voice barely above a whisper. "What in the hell?" Frank Dawson crossed his arms and uttered something that might have been a prayer. Even the hardened ranch hands, used to violence and danger, felt their chests tighten at the sight. They had expected injuries, maybe tragedy. Instead, they were met with a scene of impossible serenity. Henry carefully opened the pen's gate, and a few men peered in, hearts pounding. Jack looked up at the subtle commotion, raising a single finger to his lips as if to say, "Do not disturb," with a slow, fluid motion. He stood, stepping toward Midnight without a halter or rope. To everyone's further astonishment, the black stallion did not flinch or lunge. Instead, he maintained a relaxed, almost curious stance. Jack leaned in, murmuring words only the horse could hear. Midnight's ears flicked but remained mostly forward. He exhaled through flared nostrils, and his entire posture suggested acceptance, if not trust. Some watchers felt a chill at the base of their spines. How had the wildest horse on the ranch, the one that had put men in the hospital, melted into this docile companion? Moving gently, Jack pressed a palm against the horse's sleek shoulder. The stallion neither spooked nor kicked, only lowered his head in a gesture that seemed almost companionable. Henry swallowed hard. He had dreamed of taming Midnight, but never imagined it would be like this, without force or fear, but through a hushed, wordless connection. Frank leaned closer to Jesse, muttering, "In 30 years here, I've never seen anything like it." Jesse nodded dumbly, for once at a loss for sarcastic remarks. Something about the moment felt sacred, as though intruding on it was akin to desecration. The men looked on, caught between awe and envy. Then, in a fluid and almost imperceptible motion, Jack reached up and placed a hand on the stallion's withers. He swung himself onto Midnight's back. No saddle, no reins, no bit. Just a man and a horse, as natural as the plains before fences ever existed. The crowd gasped. A few, out of sheer reflex, stepped forward, expecting Midnight to explode. But the horse merely shifted beneath Jack's weight, then began a slow walk around the pen. The old man's knees and hands communicated subtle signals, guiding the horse with gentle pressure, as if this were an everyday routine. They circled the arena in silence, dust swirling around their hooves. The men outside the fence broke into spontaneous applause, though it quickly hushed again. There was something too profound about the scene for rowdy celebration. It was not a performance, but a communion. The ones clapping quieted, exchanging glances as they realized that applause felt almost inappropriate. This was not showmanship. It was pure partnership. Henry, for his part, felt his chest tighten at the sight. He had tried for weeks to contain, subdue, and break this stallion. Now, in mere hours, Jack Morrison had achieved the impossible without a single lash of a whip. The older ranch owner's eyes flickered with a mixture of respect, envy, and an undercurrent of guilt he couldn't place. After a few rounds in the pen, Jack slid off the horse's back, landing softly on the dirt. The horse stood quietly, nostrils flaring but calm. Jack turned to see Luke Callahan near the rail, watching with a face full of wonder. "Come here, son," Jack called gently, beckoning him closer. Luke froze, uncertain, until Henry nodded for him to go ahead. He inched into the round pen, heart pounding. "Put your hand out," Jack instructed. With some hesitation, Luke extended his palm. The black stallion stepped forward, lowering his head. His muzzle touched Luke's hand in a feather-light gesture. Luke's eyes widened, an unspoken grin tugging at his lips. Jack placed a hand on the horse's shoulder. "His name isn't Midnight," he said. "A name like that puts a cage on him. He was never just darkness and rage." He paused, glancing at the fine sheen of the horse's coat, its muscles trembling with life and possibility. He's Shadow, something misunderstood. A shape we fear until we realize it's only as dark as the light allows. A hush swept over the pen as the new name sank in. Shadow, a subtle shift that evoked empathy rather than terror. Luke patted the horse's muzzle, voice trembling with awe. "Shadow," he repeated under his breath, as though testing its resonance. No one applauded. No one spoke. They merely stood transfixed, processing the magnitude of what had just happened. Shadow, once the unstoppable scourge of Shadow Ridge Ranch, grazed peacefully beside the very people who had feared him. Jack Morrison, an old man many had mocked or doubted, seemed unruffled, as if this were exactly the outcome he had anticipated. Henry hovered in the background, eyes fixed on the scar running across Jack's forearm, an old brand, or a burn, or something that told of a harsh past. The man behind that scar had just accomplished a near miracle. But the look in Henry's gaze suggested more than admiration. It hinted at memories, regrets, and a storm of buried emotions too complex to name. As the last rays of sun disappeared behind distant hills, Jack glanced at Henry, then at the silent circle of workers. His eyes reflected a quiet resolution, as if this was only the beginning. The horse was calm, but the deeper tale, the old wounds, and the secrets that Henry and Jack carried had yet to be revealed. A warm, golden glow emanated from the chandelier in the main dining room of the Shadow Ridge Ranch house, though the soft light did little to dispel the palpable chill that gripped its 3 occupants. The long, polished table usually hosted business associates or visiting relatives, but tonight it felt like an arena where past, present, and future would clash. Jack Morrison sat with his back straight, fingers laced together atop the table. His weathered face remained impassive, but a certain tension lingered in the slight furrow of his brow. Directly across from him sat Eleanor Ellie Callahan, her simple dark dress reflecting her subdued mood. She clutched a napkin tightly in her lap, knuckles white with apprehension. At the head of the table was Henry Callahan, silently slicing into a piece of roast beef. The sound of his knife against the china plate was jarringly loud in the heavy silence. At last, it was Ellie who broke the stifling quiet. Placing her napkin on the table, she fixed her gaze on Jack. "I saw you with Shadow today," she began, her voice trembling in an effort to remain calm. "That horse listened to you, as if it recognized your spirit." Henry paused mid-cut, his jaw tight. He cast a sidelong glance at Jack, but said nothing. Jack returned Ellie's look with quiet patience, as though ready for whatever confession or confrontation might come next. Outside the dining room's curtained windows, the hush of the ranch at dusk felt like a world away from the emotional storm building inside. Ellie drew a shaky breath, mind pulled back through decades of memory. "I remember when you first arrived at Shadow Ridge," she said, her gaze drifting momentarily to Henry before returning to Jack. "You were barely more than a boy yourself, but you had the calmest hands. People said even the wildest horses would settle under your touch." Henry exhaled softly, though he kept his focus on his plate. That old history was something he had never wanted to revisit. Ellie continued, her voice thick with long-buried emotion. "I was young, stubborn, too, in my own way. My father was pressing me to marry someone of proper standing. But then I saw you training the horses in the main corral. I saw how you treated them as equals, how you listened." A faint, rueful smile touched her lips. "I think that's when I started falling in love." Jack's gaze dropped for a second, as though these recollections carried a weight he could scarcely bear. Back then, he had been a quiet hand on the ranch, rarely speaking unless it concerned the care of horses. Yet rumors had swirled about his uncanny ability. Even Don Thomas Callahan, Henry's father and the previous patriarch, had acknowledged that Jack possessed a gift for taming what others deemed untamable. Ellie's voice tightened. "We tried to keep our closeness hidden, but you know how it is on a ranch. Everyone sees everything. Eventually. It wasn't long before Don Thomas found out. And when he did," she paused, swallowing hard, tears threatening to breach her composure. "He accused you of stealing a prized silver-studded saddle. Called you a traitor, a snake in the grass," he said. Her lips quivered at the memory. "Before I could speak on your behalf, he had you branded as a thief and thrown out under the cover of night. No trial, no chance to defend yourself." Henry set down his knife and fork with a sharper clatter than intended. He did not interrupt, but his tense posture made it clear he knew where this was heading. Meanwhile, Jack stared down at his folded hands. In that moment, his entire demeanor spoke of suppressed anguish. More than 3 decades had passed since that night. Yet the recollections were as vivid as though they had happened yesterday. Ellie's tearful whisper broke the hush. "You vanished, and I was left behind in a house full of lies, forced to pretend nothing had happened." Her breath caught, and she raised the napkin to dab at her eyes. "After a shaky exhale," she continued, voice uneven, The night you were forced out, I was carrying a secret no one else knew. Jack, I was pregnant. Jack stiffened. His gaze darted up, and for an instant, the hurt in his eyes was both raw and immediate. Ellie continued, pressing a trembling hand to her chest. My father-in-law, Henry's father, decided that the only way to preserve the ranch's reputation was to cover up any hint of scandal. He insisted I marry Henry at once. She paused, glancing at Henry. To be fair, Henry didn't protest too much. Maybe part of him believed in saving face, or maybe he just wanted to protect me, or to keep his father at bay. I was in no position to question it. A deep, quavering sigh escaped her. And so the family announced that the child I carried was Henry's. The few older folks on the ranch who suspected otherwise, well, they stayed silent. They feared Don Thomas more than their own conscience. Her voice wavered again. So yes, Henry and I wed. But it was never a real marriage of love. It was more like two people trapped under the same roof, complicit in a lie that stretched on for 30 years. Jack felt as though someone had driven a nail through his heart. He had never known Ellie was pregnant when he was cast out. During his solitary decades, he had nursed resentment, heartbreak, and confusion. But he had not imagined a child was involved. Slowly, he exhaled, as though releasing 30 years of tension. All this time, Ellie said, tears streaming down her cheeks, I've carried that guilt. I lied to my own son about his birthright, about who he really is, and I lied to you too. Jack, by not trying harder to stop them from sending you away. Henry spoke not a word, but his eyes were downcast, his shoulders taut. He had known bits and pieces of the truth, but hearing it laid bare in a single unbroken confession made the weight of it infinitely heavier. For a moment, Jack closed his eyes, as if shutting out the present to wrestle with the torrent of revelations. Ellie's sobs filled the silence. Yet Jack did not shout or slam his fists on the table. Instead, he inhaled carefully, as though steeling himself. When he finally opened his eyes, he turned to Ellie. The hard lines of his face softened. All those years I spent alone, wandering from one place to another, I thought about what happened, about how they pinned that theft on me. I clung to anger. It was my lifeline. In a way, but I never hated you. Ellie. His voice was gentle, and it caused Ellie to break into fresh tears. I suspected there was more going on, but I couldn't figure out what. He continued. I found out too late that Don Thomas was behind it all. You were just a victim of that man's greed and iron will. Ellie put a hand over her mouth, stifling a sob. Jack then turned toward Henry, the question in his eyes plain. And you? Henry, did you know she was pregnant? Did you know that child was mine? Henry looked up, the lamplight reflecting in his eyes. He said nothing for a moment, gathering the nerve to speak. Finally, he nodded, voice taut. I didn't know right away, he confessed. We married quickly, mostly at Father's insistence. Ellie never told me the details at first, but later, when my mother passed, she left me a letter. His mouth tightened as though the memory of that letter haunted him. She wrote that my father had orchestrated the entire thing, accusing you of theft, branding you as a criminal. It was his twisted way of keeping the ranch's finances and reputation intact. When I read it, some years had already passed. By then, Tom was, well, he was a young man. He showed a talent with horses that felt strangely different from mine. Henry swallowed hard. I should have said something. But I was afraid. Afraid of losing everything my father built. Afraid of the scandal if folks found out Tom wasn't truly my blood. This ranch, its name, its legacy, that was all I had at the time. His voice quivered momentarily. I never intended to hurt you, Jack. Or you, Ellie. But I let my fear do the talking for me. In the ensuing silence, the truth weighed like lead on the heavy oak table. Jack's breath caught, and he lowered his head, voice barely a whisper. Tom, is my son? Ellie nodded, tears glistening as she mustered a trembling smile. Not just my child, but our child, yours and mine. He's grown into a fine man, and he's had a good life here. But he deserves to know the truth of his blood. For an instant, None of them spoke. The words hovered in the air like a thundercloud, ready to unleash a storm of consequences. 30 years of silence and deception unraveled in a single breath. Finally, Henry pushed his plate away, eyes downcast. Ellie quietly wept, and Jack stared at his calloused hands, trying to reconcile the magnitude of what he had just learned. A heavy hush settled in the dining room, broken only by Ellie's soft sniffles. Jack fought the urge to stand and walk out into the night, to clear his head of the swirl of grief and revelation. He stayed, though, sensing there was more to come. Indeed, Henry rose from his chair, crossing the room in slow, deliberate steps. At the far side of the dining room, an old portrait of Don Thomas Callahan hung on the wall, the light of the chandelier casting ghostly shadows across the painted face. Henry stopped beneath it, turning halfway toward the flickering lamp on the side table. His voice came out low, almost a rasp. "There's something else you both need to know." He paused, setting his fingertips against the windowsill where moonlight slanted in. "I've been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The doctors say there's not much they can do." Jack's heart clenched. Ellie let out a stifled gasp, and her eyes darted between Henry and Jack as if trying to process yet another layer of tragedy. Henry exhaled shakily, pressing his hand to his temple. "I won't pretend I've been a good husband, Ellie, or an honest friend. Jack, I've spent too many years letting fear of my father's legacy hold me prisoner. But there's one thing I can do before I go, something I should have done ages ago." He moved to a small, ornate side desk, where he opened a drawer. Removing a thin chain, he held it up so the others could see the silver object dangling from it. The piece glinted under the light, a simple silver insignia, worn by time. Turning to Jack, Henry extended it. "This was yours," Henry said, voice almost shaking. "Father took it from you when he had you banished. I've kept it, though I never had the courage to return it until now." Jack stared at the pendant, recalling a time when it hung around his neck like a quiet symbol of pride. Accepting it meant accepting the memories and wounds that came with it. Jack reached out, fingers trembling as they closed around the silver insignia. For a fleeting moment, it felt as cold and heavy as the decades he had spent in exile. He didn't speak, letting the magnitude of the gesture settle between them. Then, with a slow exhalation, he nodded. "I didn't come here seeking revenge," he said softly, lifting his gaze to Henry. "All I've ever wanted was to understand why it had happened. And now I suppose I do." He swallowed, memories of lonely trails and ramshackle bunkhouses sweeping through his mind. Each one marked a place he had rested for a night or a season, never belonging, always drifting. "I only returned because of that horse, Shadow. I thought maybe if I showed up, I could find some closure. But learning about Tom, that changes everything." Ellie dabbed at her tears with a corner of her napkin. "Tom is a good man," she said through the lump in her throat. "He has your calm way with horses, your diligence. All these years, I've seen pieces of you in him, reminding me of what we lost." Jack nodded, letting the silver emblem slip into his palm. "I wish I could have been there for him," he murmured. "But I can't turn back time. I only hope to see him become the man he was always meant to be." Henry cleared his throat, an air of quiet resolution about him. "Jack, Ellie, we can't keep Tom in the dark any longer. He deserves the truth from all of us." Ellie's face tightened with worry. "He's proud. And in many ways, he's followed in Henry's footsteps. But he also has such a genuine heart. I can't predict how he'll react." Jack studied the lines in his calloused hand. "If he's anything like you describe, he'll be strong enough to handle it, but it won't be easy." He hesitated, voice trembling just a fraction. "I'm not here to replace Henry in his life. I just need him to know where he truly comes from." A flicker of regret passed through Henry's features. "I've always cared about Tom. He's been like a son to me. Maybe I'd hoped I could avoid this day. But my illness has a way of reminding me that time isn't on my side anymore." He looked at Ellie, then at Jack. "We'll do this together. He needs to hear it from all three of us." Ellie offered a weak smile, relief warring with anxiety in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Thank you both for understanding that it's Tom's right to know." The three of them drifted toward the wide windows at the end of the dining room, drawn by the silver glow of the moon. Outside, the ranch lay quiet, the gentle hush of the night punctuated only by crickets and the distant whinny of a horse. In the far corral, Shadow stood with a lowered head, occasionally flicking his tail. Luke was there too, brushing the stallion's dark coat under the dim glow of lantern light. Jack touched the pane of glass with a trembling fingertip. "You see that horse? He was misunderstood from the day he arrived here. Everyone branded him as vicious, uncontrollable. But all he really needed was for someone to listen." Henry stood beside him, arms crossed as though trying to hold himself steady. "It's amazing how quickly a misunderstanding can build into a wall of fear," he admitted. Then, with a glance at Jack, he added, "That goes for us too. All these years, we built so many walls, lies, half-truths, silence. Maybe it's time to tear them down." Ellie stepped to Jack's other side. The reflection of her face in the window showed a woman weighed by sorrow, yet stirred by hope. "In the end," she said quietly, "the truth is the only thing that can set us free." They stood there together, three figures in the moonlit dining room, each bearing scars from a history they could no longer avoid. For a moment, no one spoke. Yet in that fragile hush, an unspoken resolution was forged. Jack would meet his son not as a tragic ghost from the past, but as a man owning up to the mistakes and injustices that had stolen 3 decades of fatherhood. Ellie would confront the guilt of her long silence. Henry would face the repercussions of his family's legacy, compounded by the race against his own illness. Outside, Shadow snorted softly, lifting his head as though aware of the trio behind the glass. Jack's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile, and Henry pressed a hand against his chest where an ache of regret mingled with the smallest flicker of relief. Ellie closed her eyes, imagining the moment when Tom would stand before them all, about to learn the one secret that would change his life forever. The hush lasted a few more heartbeats before Jack turned away from the window. The silver insignia he had just reclaimed glinted in his palm, a reminder of who he had been and who he might become again. None of them had the illusions that the road ahead would be simple, but for the first time in 3 decades, the path was clear. In that silent unity, they left the dining room. The chandelier's light continued to burn, illuminating the empty chairs and the vestiges of a shared meal, symbolic of a family that had, at last, begun to face its deepest truths. The final echo of footsteps faded into the hallway, leaving the flicker of lamplight dancing across the portrait of Don Thomas Callahan, as though even he, in his austere painted form, could not remain unaffected by the night's revelations. Sunlight spilled gently over Shadow Ridge Ranch, gilding the low fences and warming the red soil beneath a crisp blue sky. From a distance, it seemed like any other tranquil morning. The horses stirred in their pens, and the ranch hands moved about with quiet efficiency. Yet behind that semblance of normalcy, 3 people carried a secret that had the power to redefine the entire ranch. Tom Callahan walked along the main corral with 2 of the ranch hands, checking on the horses' feed and water. To anyone watching, he appeared as calm and methodical as ever, nodding at each worker's report. But a subtle tension weighed on his shoulders. He sensed that something monumental was brewing. He just didn't know what. Farther up the path, Jack Morrison, Henry Callahan, and Eleanor Callahan stood near the porch of the main house. Their footsteps were hushed. They hadn't slept much, each occupied by the thought of the looming confrontation. This was the day they would reveal the truth to Tom. Each harbored a private dread over how it might unravel. But there was no alternative. They had made a pact, and there was no turning back. From his vantage point near the horses, Tom heard the sound of deliberate footsteps. He turned and saw an unfamiliar sight: Henry and Jack walking side by side, with Ellie slightly behind them. The 3 approached at a steady pace, their postures taut but purposeful, as though each had decided on this course and would not be swayed. Around them, the ranch hands paused in their tasks, curious and a little unsettled. Few had expected to see Henry so visibly allied with a man many of them had viewed as an interloper. Tom's brow furrowed when he caught sight of his mother, Ellie, accompanying Henry and Jack. He had rarely seen her walking outside at this hour. More striking was the presence of Jack himself, the old horse whisperer who had stunned the ranch by taming the feral stallion. The air felt charged, as though the ranch had slipped into hushed anticipation. Tom handed his notepad to one of the workers, urging him to continue the checks alone. Then he took a few steps forward, meeting their approach. A prickle of unease stirred in his stomach, but he drew in a breath and set his jaw, ready to listen. Ellie spoke first, her voice trembling despite her best effort to remain composed. "Tom, there's something you should have known a long time ago." Tom noticed the anxiety in her eyes. "What is it?" he asked gently, though he felt a coil tighten in his gut. He glanced at his father, his presumed father, Henry, searching for answers in the man's lined face. Henry came forward by one step, removing his hat as he did so. "Son," he began, voice thick with emotion, "you are a good man. Honest, strong, thoughtful. But your character, it doesn't come from me. It never did. It comes from him." He tilted his head to indicate Jack, standing beside Ellie. A hush fell. Some workers hovered at the edge of the corrals, sensing the weight of the words without fully understanding them. Tom's eyes widened in confusion. He shifted his gaze to Jack, trying to make sense of Henry's revelation. Jack looked back at him, grim yet steady. Their gazes locked, and Tom saw regret and hope intertwined in the old man's gaze. Ellie swallowed, tears threatening to appear. We have kept this secret for 3 decades. But we can't anymore. You need to know who you really are." Silence stretched, tense as a wire pulled to its limit. Tom felt his heart pounding in his ears. He had never questioned that he was Henry's son. The possibility of any other truth had never crossed his mind. A charged stillness seized Tom. His legs felt rigid, and his mind raced through disjointed questions he couldn't yet articulate. At last, he managed. "Then what are you saying?" Jack stepped forward, holding out a calloused, weathered hand. Though his posture was hesitant, a fierce longing radiated from him. His voice, low and apologetic, trembled slightly. "Tom, I'm your father. I should have been there for you from the day you were born. But life, well, it took a different turn." Tom stared at the offered hand, seeing the scars and thick calluses, signs of a man who had spent decades working with horses, sleeping in rough bunkhouses, and traveling dusty roads. He looked up to meet Jack's eyes. In that wordless exchange, Tom sensed an avalanche of regret, hope, sorrow, and unspoken love. For several heartbeats, no one spoke. Then, silently, Tom reached out, and their palms pressed together in a handshake that felt more like an embrace of souls. No fiery anger erupted from Tom's throat. No tears erupted from his eyes. Yet everyone watching could tell that something profound was unfolding. 2 men bridging a 30-year gap in the space of a single gesture. Ellie let out a quavering breath, placing her hand against her chest. Henry lowered his hat, the faintest sign of relief glimmering in his gaze. The onlookers, Frank, Jesse, and others, stood in respectful silence, understanding that the moment transcended any commentary they could offer. Jack cleared his throat. "I don't want anything," he said softly. "I just want to see you live your life as you truly are." Tom said nothing, only nodded slowly. It was enough. Ellie closed her eyes for a brief second, pressing her fingers against the erratic beat of her heart. She felt gratitude and sorrow mingle, as if finally releasing a breath held for far too long. Henry rested a hand on the brim of his hat, genuine relief flickering in his eyes, mixed with lingering guilt. Jack turned to Tom, his voice quiet. "I never dreamed we'd stand like this, face to face. But if you can accept me, I promise I'll never hide from the truth again." Tom responded with a measured nod that spoke volumes. He wasn't ready to name all the emotions whipping through him. Anger at being lied to, confusion over his identity, a strange burst of longing for the father he never knew. Yet beneath it all, he sensed a profound rightness. The ranch hands, sensing the climax had passed, gradually returned to their tasks with renewed focus. as if they understood that something fundamental had shifted in the ranch's very foundation. A new day was indeed beginning at Shadow Ridge, and it wasn't just the sunlight that made it bright. For the first time in years, the weight of secrets had begun to lift, revealing the glimmer of a more honest future. Later that morning, Luke Callahan sat on a low wooden bench beside the black horse they now called Shadow. Despite all the tension and drama circling the ranch, Luke found solace in these quiet moments with the stallion. The horse, once known as Midnight, had become a walking symbol of change. Once feared, now a companion, Luke ran his fingers gently through Shadow's mane. In a soft tone, he spoke to the horse as if conversing with a friend. "I guess everything's different now," he murmured, recalling the scene of Tom and Jack's revelation. But maybe that's okay. Maybe different is good. Shadow let out a low huff, dropping his head so Luke could stroke his forelock. The stallion's eyes glistened with a calmness unimaginable only weeks ago. Gone was the wild fury, replaced by a serene acceptance, almost as though the horse had chosen to be part of this family, bridging gaps no human words could. Jack Morrison approached from behind, his footsteps muffled by the dusty ground. Watching Luke interact with Shadow brought a faint smile to Jack's face. "He seems to trust you," Jack said softly, stepping closer. Luke turned, nodding. "He does. He's different than he was. Or maybe he's finally showing who he always was underneath. Must be that he found someone who listened." Jack agreed. The two lingered in silence, comforted by Shadow's steady presence. A moment later, Tom arrived. He walked up to them hesitantly, unsure if his presence would shatter the fragile peace, but Luke beckoned him closer, and Jack nodded a quiet welcome. The older man moved aside so Tom could stand beside Luke, forming a small triangle around Shadow. They said nothing initially, the morning breeze brushing against their cheeks. The stallion's ears flicked forward, acknowledging Tom's approach. Tom reached out a hand, laying it gently on Shadow's shoulder. His touch was cautious, but the horse leaned into it as if recognizing Tom's unsettled heart. Jack's chest tightened at the sight. He had dreamed for decades of meeting the child he never knew. And here they were, 3 generations, Jack, Tom, and Luke, gathered around a horse that had once been labeled uncontrollable. Luke broke the silence with a light laugh. "You see, Grandpa, he's not so bad once you know him." Tom blinked, momentarily thrown by Luke's carefree reference to Jack as Grandpa. The boy had adapted quickly to the idea that Jack was part of the family. Tom's eyes flicked to Jack, cautious but without hostility. "He really does listen," Tom said quietly, referring to the horse, though perhaps also to Jack. Jack nodded, his voice touched with awe. "It seems we're all learning how to listen around here." High on the ranch house's balcony, Eleanor Ellie Callahan stood close to Henry. She wore a simple blouse, the breeze ruffling her hair. In contrast, Henry wore his usual hat, which he touched now and again, more out of habit than need. Both of them watched the scene unfolding below, the sight of Jack, Tom, Luke, and Shadow forming a quiet tableau. Ellie felt hot tears prick her eyes, but for once, they weren't tears of regret. This time, the tears tasted of relief. "After all these years," she whispered, "the truth isn't buried anymore. They've found each other." Henry exhaled, shoulders sagging as though a heavy burden had been lifted. "I wish my father could see this," he said, almost to himself. Though if he had, he might have learned a valuable lesson about what real love looks like. Ellie slipped her arm through Henry's, leaning her head lightly against his shoulder. "Sometimes letting go is harder than holding on," she said, echoing an adage that lingered in her heart. Don Thomas never knew how to let people choose freely. He forced us all into a box of expectations and lies. Henry's gaze fell to the courtyard. "I'm just grateful it's not too late for us. Not too late for them." A fleeting pang reminded him of his terminal diagnosis, but he pushed that thought aside for now, focusing on the grace of this moment. Tom discovering his real father, and all of them learning what it meant to forgive. Ellie blinked back tears, grateful that honesty had finally trumped secrecy. At a respectful distance, the ranch hands gathered to watch, quietly absorbed in the transformation of their once chaotic environment. Frank Dawson pressed a hand over his chest, as though feeling something sacred in the air. Beside him, Jesse Ray stood with an uncharacteristic solemnity, having shed his usual smugness. He tipped his hat in silent acknowledgement when he glimpsed Jack and Tom together. "Old Man Morrison didn't just tame that horse," murmured a younger worker, awe coloring his voice. "He healed it." Frank nodded, swallowing hard. Seems like he healed more than just the horse. They exchanged glances, as though aware that this moment carried lessons for everyone present. A sense of reverence blanketed the ranch, one that transcended words and latched onto the hearts of men who'd seen their fair share of hardships. Below the porch, Shadow released a soft snort, lifting his head to rest it gently against Jack's chest, like a child who had finally found the security of a parent's arms. Luke stepped aside to give the horse room, then turned to Tom with an eager question in his eyes. "Grandpa," Luke asked Jack with an unself-conscious familiarity, "how did you know Shadow wouldn't attack you anymore?" Jack's mouth curved into a faint smile. "Because I looked into his eyes," he replied, resting a hand on the horse's forelock. "Eyes don't lie, not a horse's, and not a person's either. You can see everything you need to if you just pay attention." Luke nodded thoughtfully, running his hand down Shadow's neck. Tom stood by, listening to every word with a somber sort of reverence. A flicker of emotion crossed his face when he realized that Jack had likely read something similar in his own eyes upon their first meeting, seeing a son he didn't know he had. Henry and Ellie watched from above, witnessing this bond that had somehow formed over the course of mere days, yet was rooted in a lifetime of searching. Their hearts ached at the memory of what had been lost, but soared at what had been found. The sun climbed higher, casting a mellow warmth across the ranch. A gentle breeze drifted through, carrying the scent of dry earth and distant sage. Shadow Ridge Ranch stirred with renewed purpose, as if nature itself sensed the quiet breakthrough among its human inhabitants. Jack turned away from the horse to glance at Henry, Ellie, Tom, and Luke, taking them in one by one. A hush fell, but it was no longer weighted by secrecy or fear. Instead, it was the hush of possibility, the silent agreement that life had changed for all of them. For the first time in decades, Jack allowed himself a genuine, unguarded smile. Not the fleeting ghost of a grin he'd worn when he first returned, nor the sad quirk of lips when confronting old wounds, but a real smile, filled with cautious hope. Henry removed his hat, pressing it against his chest as a sign of respect. Ellie's tears glistened in the mid-morning light, yet her face shone with relief and gratitude. Tom stood rooted, uncertain of his new identity as Jack's son, but quietly determined to embrace the future with honesty. A fresh day rose at Shadow Ridge, not just with sunlight, but with the promise of a life no longer shackled by the past. Perhaps they couldn't reclaim the years gone by, but they could shape the time remaining. And as the ranch hands returned to their labors with new reverence, and Shadow nickered softly to Luke, the Callahan family, now, finally, whole, looked forward rather than back. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed the journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit the notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.